this is data that we have, that people with disorders of the corpus callosum they will believe someone is sincere far more readily than most people will, even when it's clear that the person's being sarcastic. That they have difficulty imagining what somebody else is thinking. So theory of mind is what we call that. It's the ability to think, you think that I think that, you think that I'll do that if you do that. That kind of, so that's part of how we recognize that somebody might be doing something suspect, right? It's our ability to imagine that they have ulterior motives. And that is truly a skill that is limited in this group. So it makes them vulnerable. Other skills that are of concern are difficulty in social interaction, reading all the cues. Those of you who will go to Warren Brown's session on callosal basics, you'll hear him talk about our understanding of the core cognitive symptoms of missing a corpus callosum. Slow processing between the hemispheres, obviously. Slow processing speed overall. So things just don't get computed as quickly. They don't think as quickly, which in a social interaction means I may be thinking about what you just said and miss what you're saying now. I may be thinking about what he said and not catch that somebody else is saying something. And you think about a group of people talking together, especially a group of teenagers, there's a lot going on, a lot of cues, often overlapping. And if your brain is processing kind of one thing, and then another thing, and then another thing, got a lot of moments in that little series where you missed information. So that's another way that people with ACC can be vulnerable. And then difficulty in complex, novel situations. So things that are new to them, that are unfamiliar, and that require processing things either in multiple modes, so listening to words and reading gestures at the same time, or maybe doing something that they can do very well under normal circumstances, but suddenly they have to do it really quickly. Where all of us would perform a little bit worse, people with DCC tend to perform a lot worse under that time pressure, which often happens in social situations, right? So a lot of these situations come up when there's a split-second decision. Do I follow those kids? Do I do this? How do I handle this situation? That makes them vulnerable. So safety to me is something that is going to dominate all of these discussions. Now, on the heels of that, you can't keep them in a box, right? Because these are human beings who have ideas and thoughts and desires and are every bit as human as the rest of us. And so cultivating a sense of self-confidence, a sense of self-respect is also part of the goal of being a teenager. So I think that balancing of I've got to acknowledge that you may be developmentally behind in some ways, and that you are hormonally not behind, and maybe you don't even look behind and everybody else thinks you're totally normal, or you do, or you are doing great in many, many areas, right? So there are all sorts of things, or you're just a sweet, wonderful person who really cares about your family, and there are great things about any of us in the room and anybody with DCC. So holding on to those in the middle of it is also really important. And one thing that we do that helps anybody live up to their best is remind them that they are good. Attribute to them what you want them to be. You're better than that. You're kinder than that. Come on, I know you. Those kind of statements that encourage the positive in your DCC or in your friends or spouse or whoever. So there's this balance of acknowledging that there may be limitations and building up what you can and what would be an asset to help the person make better choices. I think the other thing that comes up to me is personal responsibility. So as you're going through teen years, and for those of you with DCCers, it's probably something you start thinking about a lot younger even, is, where are we heading here? How do I build these life skills? How do I help him or her build life skills that will lead toward as much independence and autonomy as possible? Because it's comforting to feel like you've got your chicks in the nest and they're safe, they're contained, and it's great. But that doesn't last, because they're going to get really restless. And even for those who are willing to stay home, I think of an anecdote from a colleague who has an adult child with ACC, and she's now in her 40s. And he said to me, we finally in her 30s realized we needed a place for her to live that was not with us. And they found I think they may have even set up a group home kind of environment where there are other people with similar disabilities. And he said, we are all so much happier. She is happier, we are happier. We get to be family and have family dinners. We don't feel like we're caseworkers or parenting a child. She doesn't feel like we're annoying and on top of her all the time. So being aware that as much as you fear, working toward that goal is something to be working toward in whatever way it can be. Now, I'll add to that, thinking of another example of a mother who said, we've got him in an apartment, he's living on his own, he's got some support. It is not a way I would live. I can barely tolerate going in there. Well, okay, is it a fire hazard? Is it a safety? I mean, she still at that point is thinking, do I need to have somebody come in and clean it regularly so there's not a basic hygiene problem or the fire marshal doesn't get called? So, we've got some level that we have to keep. But under that, it's his. If he wants to live like that, I can't abide. I can't change that. So I think that's another hard thing that starts going on through the teen years, is as you're trying to inform the values and the life skills and provide life skills, at the same time, at some point, they're going to make their choices about how they live. Now, but you want them to have choice, right? You want them to have the choice because they know how to do things. So, and all of these things speak up to the safety issue, because we have pride in ourselves when we can do things. I watch my great nieces and great nephews, little people who, I'll do it, I can help. I can do the laundry, I can fold my laundry and take it to my room. Well, I presume, having remembered being a teenager, what it's like to not want to take my laundry. But you watch a little kid and you say, oh wow, they really take pride in this, and getting to be a part of the family and doing things that other people do. Capitalize on it. And that's the whole way through, but look for those moments of reinforcing basic competence, things that you can do. At the same time, you're building the skill set that will become automatic, familiar patterns that they can do when they can someday leave home. So another example, a lot of times, surprising how many times I've had families contact me whose child with ACC made it through high school, did okay, got into college, went away to college, and the wheels came off the bus, and it was a mess. And the complexity, new situations, managing your time, all the social interactions, the cognitive load of college, all of those things. But then I started talking with the parent and I'm asking, have they ever done their laundry by themselves? Did they know how to use a coin laundry machine? Did they know how to make basic foods in the microwave for breakfast if they couldn't get to the cafeteria. All of these things that they were going to have to do, that those are the things that you can teach ahead of time. You can practice that ahead of time. You can't practice the social skills. But thinking in terms of, all right, what are those skills they're going to need to have that I don't even remember learning because they seemed so obvious, probably. But if we can practice it now and offload that stress, that's one less thing they have to worry about, right? And they have more self-respect. So those are the kind of things that I think of in responsibility and functional life skills. And then, of course, one of the main issues is relationships. And we talk a lot about people with dysgenesis having a higher incidence of autism behaviors than the broader population. So maybe 30 to 40% of the people, in adults we were finding about 30% of the higher functioning people with agenesis, so people with an IQ of 80 and above, not a lot of other brain abnormalities, still 30% of them showed the behavioral patterns of autism. So poor social skills, a tendency to get fixated on things and have specialized interests. But one of the things that's common in some types of autism, because autism isn't really just one thing, is social isolation and a lack of interest. Some people with autism just have no interest in social interaction. And that's not typically the case in our adults with ACC. They want social interaction. It's just they often struggle to do it and do it well. And so they end up isolated. And that's why I think we have 70 adults with ACC at this conference. Almost a quarter of the attendees are people with this diagnosis because they're lonely. Because this is where they have friends who understand them, who they feel safe with, who, even though there's going to be all sorts of teen-like drama, probably, they come back to each other time and again because they're safe. So that drive towards social connection is important to acknowledge and to think about ahead of time and think, how can we facilitate that in the safest ways possible? So one thing I will say on that is when things get more complicated, and this is going to overlap with Jasmine's session on social skills, but as things get more complicated, one of the things that we do, and we do this throughout life at different phases, we get a little anxious because too much is coming at us and it's too hard, and so we start to get a little bit rigid. We start to try to stop and contain. It's an instinct toward consistency is one of the phrases that we use. We want things to be stable. We don't want surprises because that leaves us anxious, right? And we want to know, what are the rules? How am I supposed to do this? Which is another thing that is a great asset in people with DCC that you can work with, is let's teach the rules. Let's teach the basic social skills so that the complicated ones we can have time and energy to try to work around. But it also then makes it so that often adults with DCC can behave very appropriately. Hi, how are you? They look very fine. And people say, I had no idea. Well, you talked with the person for 5 minutes. It's going to take longer than that to get beyond the 5-minute rules. And I would say probably for your children as they get older, that window of when the rules still apply and I know how to behave is going to get longer and longer, which is great. It's going to buy them social currency. It's going to buy them welcome and goodwill. And you want to build those skills. At the same time, being aware that on the back end of that, there are going to be all sorts of other complicated things to keep working on that are harder. But that The rule-based component is something you can work with. The other thing is the rigidity. And I'll always bring this up, but regardless how you feel about complicated issues like, these days it may not be a complicated issue. I'm from Indiana from the 80s, so I'm old and conservative, premarital sex and sex in high school and all those things were big topics back then. Maybe it's not now, but maybe you want them to be in your home. Maybe you want your teen with ACC to be in an environment where everybody agrees that that's not how we do things. So the social pressure is pushing them into a safer place, into less risk. It's just one of the strategies you can use. It's a thought. They're going to follow the people around them, and they're going to want social connection, so put them in a place where they're with people that have the values you want them to live by and learn those rules. It's one of the strategies. Other core things that I think are moving toward being self-supporting, if possible, and to the extent possible. And I would say for self-supporting, it's important to keep options open. So another thing that I've come up against with families is who have fought very hard not to have their teenager with ACC or DCC labeled. So I don't want them to have a diagnosis of autism. I don't want them to, they're doing okay in school. I don't want to go over the edge and have them feel like they have a problem. But then as things get more and more complicated and they get into their 20s and you actually start to need some help, you have no paper trail. And when it comes to getting services in our social system, having a paper trail that says, yes, this is a diagnosis that started way back when, that has had long-term implications, matters. And I see that nod from somebody who does this work professionally. It makes a difference. So having that documented before they're 18, having them connected to their regional center or whatever, actually is helping them toward independence, because if they need services to get subsidized housing, to have a social worker or a job coach, that is part of how they get that job coach. Does that make sense? So it's not limiting them, it will ultimately be a tool that will help them. And it may be that there hits a point where they realize, okay, I don't think this person can hold a full-time job because they get overloaded. It's just too much. But half-time can do that. I just met with a family that I've met with for quite a while. He's now 30. Yeah, 30, I think. One of the people that was in one of our studies, so graduate of high school, smart and average intelligence, no major cognitive impairment, but he does get pretty overloaded, and he gets tired. So another thing that is a limiting factor in adulthood is if your brain is missing this huge, the biggest white matter tract in the brain here, it's major thoroughfare. If its major communication system is not there, the cool thing is the brain develops and says, oh, I got to come up with a backup plan here. And we're built with backup plans. We have alternate connections. We have all sorts of ways that our brain is wired to help us compensate if something goes wrong. So I think one way to think about it is, if you're missing your corpus callosum entirely, then you're working with the backup system. You're working on the generator already. There's nothing else behind there. And at optimal functioning, it's fine. If any of your physicians and ever been in a rural area, a generator can get you through a surgery, great. It's not going to get through a whole day of surgeries, probably. right? And it's not like it slowly declines over time. It's like the generator dies and it dies. There's and how many of you feel like if you have ACC or your family member does, that's kind of the trajectory of energy. It's kind of like, oh, we're going okay, and then we are head on the desk done. Or screaming done, or on the floor done, starfished for all to see. I mean, but if you think, oh, but we have no backup system. So all those other kids in the classroom or the other adults got partway through the workday, drank some coffee, took a deep breath, stretched out, remembered some other things, pulled out some energy, got other systems online to keep them going. These people are fatigued. And I say all that because in working with this young man, what we realized is, yeah, he can hold a job. And you want him to. Why shouldn't he? He can contribute to society, it gives him meaning, it gives him social interactions. It's part of being an adult, it's part of living life. Can he earn enough to support himself? Can he hold a job that's going to get him benefits because he works 3/4 time? No. So then you end up in this real dilemma of, okay, do we get Social Security disability so that he's got some basic income, or so that he got services, he can get Medi-Cal or Medicare or whatever it is, so he's got those things, and we accept that he's only going to work part-time because you can only work so much. So those are the kind of decisions that are coming as you get older, but if you aren't aware of them earlier, you can kind of make it harder and harder to have those options open. And I also want to say all that because I want you to understand that being a functional adult may look really different. I sat with the judge, I guess 10 years ago, and said, this is what he has, this is how this works. We talked it through, he understood, he said, all right, we'll give him disability. Every so often they need to do the paperwork and we meet again, and I always ask and check and think, if he didn't need it anymore, by all means, we would change it. But I certainly don't want to push him to be an adult in my terms of adult and have him fall on his face because it's too much. I'd rather watch him through his 20s do what he's doing, which is come back in this last time and say, so my job coach comes, and when I started to have a problem with so-and-so, I knew to call the job coach, and I'm getting better about prioritizing. Prioritizing is what I'm working on. I mean, he's learning how to work in the workplace. It is a much more gradual process because it's all complicated and it's always novel. But through his 20s, he's getting better at it. He's more stable in his job. He finally, the last time of reviews, got all acceptables, no needs improvements in his job review after 5 or 6 years. And he feels good about that, and he should. He's got pride that he can pay for his own cell phone, so he may not do everything, but those are important factors. So these are just some of my thoughts about getting yourself thinking about the future. So what about your hopes and fears? What are the other things you want for your kids? What have I missed that you think is critical for parenting teens in general, or? Yeah. Yeah. So the question is, because we have a live stream audience, For a 13-year-old who has big dreams, big job goals, moving across the country, how do you help him develop more realistic goals considering his levels of ability? I think it's a great opportunity then to focus on how you would get those jobs. You start to break it down into the details. And there'll be resistance in that idea, but that is a basic skill we all have to have for a lot of things. So that practice of, okay, well, let's start thinking about what would it take to get there. So then you're not breaking down the dream, but it may be that he realizes at some point along those steps, this step is really not. So then you have a little room to negotiate and say, okay, well, if that part's too hard, you can't be an engineer because math is really hard for you, but you really like to build things. What are other things that you could do that use that skill? So it's a way of affirming the interest and maybe even some components of ability without going whole hog on, oops, I think you're going to do this. And it's starting to give more realistic understanding of what's involved. I think that would be my strategy. Anything else? Mm-hmm.
I would say for me, the hardest thing now, my son just turned 18 graduating. To quote him, he said he had an existential crisis when he graduated because he feels, he looks around, he sees his sister, he sees what his other friends are doing, going to college. He's a smart kid, right? But he knows he can't keep up and he does have that end point. So to me, it's the opposite. It's trying to foster, okay, you can do something you like. It doesn't mean you need a 4-year degree or that you have to be a scientist to work with marine animals. Let's look at other kinds of jobs. But it's, I'm good at like finding alternatives, but for me, I would like some advice on how to like foster, and I hope they do this in the adult groups, foster more feelings that they can achieve things, just it looks differently. The idea of hope and achievement is possible, even if their peers are at an accelerated speed. That's the kind of advice if you have any, or
Yeah.
to kind of foster this, like they're not going to just be subjugated to their job because they feel they can't handle anything.
Right. So the issue is that transition, particularly from late teens into 20s, as peers are starting to really take off into independence, and a young adult teenager may feel like, I'm not going to be able to keep up, and give up hope for themselves. And how do you foster hope and realistic dreams? It's a really difficult time. And I would say there's, for a lot of families, somewhere between 18 and 35, comes a crisis where there's either a face-off of what the parent thinks the person can do and what they think they can do. That may be one. And it may go either direction. It may be that the person thinks they can do anything and should be able to do anything, and the parent's saying, oh my gosh, this is going to be a disaster. Or the parents saying, come on, get off your butt and do something. You're capable of doing things, and they have no motivation and feel depressed because they're not like their peers. Or variations on those themes. And that window of time, I think, is so important because of what you just described, the disparity between themselves and their peers. You go from school, where everybody's in the same place, activities are prescribed, even if you're in a special classroom, you're still in a classroom. Everybody else is still there. It feels like you're on track. And you hit 18, and people spread. You've got the kids that do vocational work. You've got the kids that fall off the rails. You've got the kids that go on to college and graduate work. And whatever their siblings have done is going to be an issue. Whatever their parents have done, those set expectations, whatever their classmates do, that's the bar that they'll look at and say, I should be able to do that. And I think part of it is just temperament, how they respond to it. Do they respond to it with fury? Do they respond to it with hopelessness? Do they respond to it with dreamy idealism and confabulation? I'm afraid there's not a really nice answer on any of that, except that by having this diagnosis throughout life, you have the opportunity to introduce it as a part of the person's identity and a part of their life, and treating it as just part of our story. This is how this is going to probably go. We've known for a long time that you're going to probably have a little bit harder time doing all these things, and tell them. We've talked at these conferences. They say that transition through the 20s just takes more time. You're on your own. You're on your own time scale. You're on your own calendar. And it's not going to match your siblings. And that's cool with me. I hope you can figure out how to make that okay with you. But having that be part of the script throughout their life, not to hold them back, but to set an expectation that says you are still growing, you are still moving, we're still achieving things. It's just you're on your own schedule. And it's frustrating, acknowledge all the frustrations and things. But, yeah. Yeah, they'll talk about that kind of stuff. Oh yeah, they'll talk about that in the adult group and normalize it. But again, in the adult group, you've got a whole range. And so one of the things that we've worked on over the years in the adult group is having the narrative in the group become more realistic. So it used to be, one of the first times I brought one of my postdocs to run those groups. And she's not a neuroscience person, she's a clinician. And I said, you'll be fine. I just kept saying, you'll be fine, you'll be fine. And she's like, what are you doing to me? You're throwing me in here to run this group with these, I don't understand. She walked out and went, oh, I get it. You put out a topic, they each go around and say what they're gonna say. None of them acknowledge what anybody else said. They all think the other people are wrong and they're right. And they're the only one that's not gonna have the problem that everybody else has. Bingo! But back then, it was if we can get them to all sit in the room and not talk over each other and be respectful, we're making some headway. These days, there will be discussion, and there will be people who come along and say, yeah, I know, that was really hard for me too. And I've seen it happen. I've seen people get upset in the adult sessions, and other people come around and support them, and then afterwards say, I'm sorry, I was inappropriate. That to me is really cool, because we're, as a culture in this community, making it okay to develop more slowly. So I hope that helps over time. I'm gonna move us on. So now we're gonna go to like some real hands-on stuff here. This is where it starts to get ugly, I'm sorry. Know your child's vulnerabilities. What are those? Like we just said, gullible, naive, tend to take people at their word. They long for friends. They want connection, they want to belong, just like everybody else. None of this is pathological. But that also makes them vulnerable. What about they look more mature than they are? This is the point when parents who have kids that have physical dysmorphisms, their face looks a little funny, or they can't talk quite right, or they're in a chair, they start to go, oh, I'm so thankful that everybody can look at my person with DCC and know that there's something going on. Because it's the ones that everyone looks at and think, you look fine. I expect you to be just like everybody else, and don't believe them when they say, I have a brain disorder and it makes me kind of slow and I have these, you're making it up. I've seen you do things just fine. You're making that up. You're just being lazy. I mean, people say all sorts of things. When it comes to safety, well, she's 18, she can give consent, she can do whatever she wants. He looks like a grown boy. The fact that he's developmentally about 10 and wants to play with the little girls in the neighborhood that are also his neighbors and are 10 suddenly becomes a real problem when he is 16. And he may not know what to do with his own drives, and he also just, to them, looks 16. And so parents are like, why are you doing this? So you get those kind of assumptions of how is this going to look to somebody else is a vulnerability. And how is somebody else who might want to take advantage of a situation going to look at it? So there are multiple scenarios. I can give anecdotes like crazy, including the one that I just gave very circumscribedly, but is one of our ACCers who did precisely that with the little girls in the neighborhood. Nothing that harmed them, but was inappropriate and caused a lot of chaos and a lot of problems. It was very painful and confusing to him, who just didn't quite get what was going on. And in that situation, one of the vulnerabilities was we had a 16-year-old who was now in vocational training in his academic situation, which was great. He's in this, masonry program, and it's learning a hands-on skill and whatever, but he's suddenly put into a cohort of guys who are talking and looking at stuff that's really rough and acting like they're doing all sorts of things, or if they aren't, exposing him to things that he'd never been exposed to. So he's getting introduced to sexuality in a way that his parents were not aware of and were not on board with. But then it makes him more curious, which is normal. Unfortunately, for these parents, part of what I recommended was, so then you gotta start introducing him to sexuality that's more what you want him to be exposed to. Ugh, I don't really wanna watch those kind of movies with my 16-year-old son. Well, yeah. One of the unfortunate things about having a teenager with DCC is you're gonna see and hear and talk about a lot of stuff you never wanted to see and hear and talk about. And if you don't, they're gonna learn from their peers, and is that really where you want them to learn? Because they tend to be concrete. They need it spelled out. They need it talked through. They need it talked through over and over again. The mom I mentioned earlier who said, I can't really handle the fact that my son's home is filthy, also will say to this day, periodically I'll just get a random message out of the blue that says, oh my goodness, I wish he would stop telling me about his sex life. Because she can't just say that to anybody. He's 40 now or something. But she's like, why do I have to have this child who still acts like a child even though he's fully grown and, But then she'll say, but I'm not gonna tell him not to because I wanna know. And if he's getting in trouble, he still needs eyes and ears to be protecting. So those are the kind of cost-benefit analyses that come up. I think that issue of giving direction is a good one. We'll come back to that. The internet, of course, is an issue. I don't know how much of an issue it is now. It definitely has been in the past. One of our ACCers was in chat rooms, and she's an adult. Some guy says, hey, I've got a party going on, come to my house. Sure. Well, guess who was at the party? Him and her. In some neighborhood where she doesn't know anybody. And one of my favorite things about that story is the fact that she was so rigid that he finally got fed up with her. She just was like, what are you doing? You're not supposed to do this. Just held on to the rules and fought back, and he ended up leaving her on the side of the road without her phone, and it was a really difficult lesson. Thankfully, it didn't get as bad as it could have. But that was her vulnerability. She had no thought that this could be bad, and he had no reason to think that she wasn't a fully consenting adult. So some of these are things I'm going to throw out just because I want you to think about them. If you come up with great solutions, share them. Because I don't know, we're all working on this together, figuring out solutions. Another vulnerability that has come up with one of the families is an older, somewhat older man at work, or a guy, this guy's at this DCCR's workplace, befriended him. Seemed fine. It's a fairly small community. Just kind of being a mentor. This young man's father's deceased, and so it seemed like a great thing, until they realized that this older gentleman had designs on this young man. Did not cross anybody's mind. And this young man in his 20s was earnest and sweet and is just lovely and confused by this, and then embarrassed by this, and didn't know how to talk about this. And of course, his mother it just had never crossed her mind to be asking those questions, because she was thrilled that this older guy had taken an interest. So I'm throwing out these examples just to give you ideas of things to be looking for, listening for, asking questions about. You have to be more suspicious than you want to be, probably. And at the same time, we're still trying to encourage independence and responsibility. So that's where I think the open communication comes in. In order to have that independence, we have to be honest about what's happening in our lives. Otherwise, we get in trouble. And that goes for all of us, right? We have to ask for help when we need help. One more on, well, I think we'll go on. So, knowing your own weaknesses, like we were just talking about, recognizing, how do you recognize that I tend to take people at their word and I get in trouble that way? And all of these things of strategizing ahead that we'll talk about now. So here's my tool chest for dealing with those safety things. I've talked about several of them. The rigidity can be an asset. Having them building, as long as you can, this open communication and encouraging that. And if it does not work with you as a parent, there's a point where it may need to shift to a sibling or to an aunt or an uncle, or this is one of the things that I've had a hard time convincing my older sisters, that there hits a point when you just let them talk to me. I've got your back. I'm going to support you as their parent. I'm not trying to get in the middle, but they're going to feel more comfortable telling me what's really going on. And I'll know the truth, and we can try to avoid some disasters, because I'm auntie, and I'm closer to their age. So those people that you do trust that can come in and be the surrogates are people you want to keep your eye out for and cultivate those friendships and relationships. Siblings someday, when they have the chance, will fill that gap. Can. And then the teachers, the coaches, but also youth leaders. And this is another anecdote that I think was just really, really wise. One of the leaders that started all of these family connections, wisely, when her son was going into high school, had identified 2 or 3 people in his grade and in a couple upper grades that were leaders, students that people looked up to, students that people followed. And she pulled them aside before the school year started and said, I want to tell you what my son has. And explained, this is his condition. He looks typical. He's going to, I don't want you to make a big deal of this, but I need you to be my eyes and ears on the ground. And if you see him starting to do something that's going to be a problem, or somebody tries to get him to throw rocks at cars, which ended up happening. You know, stop it, please. You know, help us. You don't have to parent him, just watch for things that are extreme. So she gathered in his peers in a very strategic and wise way. Because again, you don't want the entire class to be like, oh, we all have to parent John because he's got a problem. But yeah, eyes and ears on the ground somewhere where it's safe, looking for that. Other ideas for safety issues? Notifying the police in your area, maybe, if it was that level of concern, or if there's a safety person at the school, making sure that those kind of leaders know. In the situation with the little girls in the neighborhood, this was particularly painful for all of us because we had just had the first of these sessions. First year we'd done this. We talked about all these things, and Mom goes home and gathers the neighbors and says, this was just brought to my attention that it could be an issue. Please do not let your young daughters play with my son. You know, when we're all together, we just always need to have eyes on them. Just for his safety, for their safety, and just so that nothing ever gets construed weird. Which was a brilliant plan. And if only the other parents had abided by it. They didn't quite believe her. But that was a good idea, to bring them in and get their support, other parents' support, and communicate it as we're protecting him because he doesn't know how somebody else would see it, not because we think he's going to become a perpetrator. So those are some of the tools that I would say. Let's go on to the sex and safety issue because we're already talking about it. Again, knowing your child's vulnerabilities, like we talked about, and strategizing to avoid risky situations. Thinking, what are they going to assume if they see my child? What are their peers going to assume? What are other adults going to assume? How would this look like to somebody else? Could somebody misread it? And how? Is there a legal risk in this situation? Are other people at risk? Is my child at risk? And I think, I was thinking about this today, these issues have become more pronounced, probably even in the last few years with the Me Too movement. Because things that people would have let slide are less likely to be looked over. There's more of a protection of particularly male to female interactions. And so things that one of our young men, his family didn't even know that he had this diagnosis until he was a senior in high school, and the cops show up at the school to arrest him. He was over 18. Parents get called in, and the girl had accused him of stalking. Well, his stalking was he kept leaving her notes in her locker and would call her, and she'd told him to stop, and he kept leaving notes in her locker and call. I mean, it was, and his response to the cop when the cop came was, well, I love her. Didn't go over real well with that cop. He was not very gracious about the guy's smart aleck response. But to him, it was just an honest response. Well, that had to go on for 6 months before that happened. Today, that wouldn't go on very long before something happened, right? So that's just a vulnerability and a being aware issue that I think you have to be more aware of right now. And that's an issue that is common in any adolescent. I mean, that age range is hard because girls mature more quickly. So a 14-year-old girl can look like she's 18 to 20, and an 18-year-old boy can be 18 or developmentally 16, or and not have any thought about the fact that there's a greater than 2-year age gap, or she's under 14, or whatever the law is in your state that would make something a legal problem. So being aware of those things is unfortunately in your best interest, and knowing who is my son or daughter dating. How could that look? Could that be a problem? And then trying to problem solve ahead of time. Now that's all the difficult part. Let's go to the more positive part. What do you really think? You have to stop as parents and say, have I always just kind of presumed that this will never be an issue? Or have I just thought, somehow it's all just going to work out? Or, yeah, where are you in this? And I have no judgments or statements about any of it. There are couples, the first time we had one of these sessions, it was a mom of a girl with Down syndrome. And the girl had married a boy who was in her, or a young man that was in her day treatment program, and they had their own house, and they had social support, and they had job coaches, and they were happy, and it was a process, and the mom just kind of had to realize there's no reason for her not to get married, except for the fact that I keep thinking of her as a child, and my presumption of being disabled didn't include this, and I've had to shift my way of thinking. I've had some parents that say, I think this is a great match. I feel a little guilty because I think the spouse is taking on more than they know they're taking on, and yet things can work out. They can be fine. I think that the key is building the honesty and having open communication with whoever they're involved with, and teaching your person with ACC to have that open communication as well and recognize those vulnerabilities. That rage may be an issue. Emotional volatility is an issue. So in relationships, it's often an issue. It's one of the most difficult things we do is sustained relationships. If you have difficulty taking other people's perspective, and you tend to get enraged and rigid when things are not going well, those are things that can become concerns. So also, thinking about marriage and relationships, really setting standards and practices in your family about how you do that. How do you handle conflict? Be proactive. Push yourselves to do the kind of growth and address things that you might not want to do, because you want to model it for your child so that they will avoid a level of problem that you would probably never get into. One of our ACCers who's married, wife is lovely and gets it and is very supportive of him. They were having a fight. And this is somebody who is full-time employed, he's successful in his career. I'm giving you a picture. This is not somebody that you would think would have this problem. Got into an argument, and we're on a walk, and his way of interacting with her caused some bypasser enough distress they called the cops. And he ends up being arrested for domestic violence in public, even though but it was a moment, she was like, but he was just so angry, and I know that about him. And he was mortified, of course, but those are those moments where it was a mix of his difficulty managing his anger, the bypasser, all of those things. I guess the other part of that is it wasn't a crisis. We dealt with it. We get assessments. You deal with the legal things. It's a pain, but we're going to keep working on them. So these are all the rules and values questions that I think are just putting out there for you to think about. And how do you introduce these topics? How do you introduce pornography and how to handle that? How do you deal with your son's attitude looking at the girls on the beach? the girl who is oblivious and is changing her clothes in front of her bedroom window, and then you discover that the man across the street has discovered when that happens. Yet another example. And helping her understand that she needs to protect herself by closing her curtains. So these are all conversations that if you don't have normal embarrassment and you don't think about other people's perspective, you're missing the feedback cues that make you protect yourself. So you become the voice of, these are the rules, this is how this works. Moving on, because we're going to run out of time. Relationships. Thinking critically about how is my child, how are their relationships? How are their friendships? How are their friendships with their relatives, with their community? Building that is another great way to build self-esteem and build them up toward the future and give them confidence. One of the things the girl who threw the fit, she is somebody who has known she has ACC. She's a part of this community. She believes in herself. She will fight for herself. And that's part of what protected her. Not because of her grand sexual experiences or her dating experiences, but because of her identity and her relationships and her friendships. That's part of what gives you support to make tough decisions. Thinking critically, again, if friendships are a real issue, definitely go to the social skills session this afternoon. But looking at beliefs, do I think that I'm normal? Do I think I'm not? What do I expect of people? One of the things that we found in some of our research was when we asked the adults about ACC, about friendship, their responses were, and pretty much across the board, very rigid. This is what a friend does. This is what they don't do. That person did that. I'm not their friend anymore. It was kind of striking. And I'm not sure what to do with that, but what I see in the younger kids is they say everybody's my friend, and they can spit in my eye one day, and the next day I still think they're my friend. And then as they get a bit older and they start to have some rules about this, and they start to get hurt too many times, and then they can get very rigid about it, is what I've seen. So let me know if you see that, and we'll continue to try to come up with strategies. We're coming down to our last 10 minutes, so I want to move us to this last topic, confabulation. So I'm going to look at these different ideas. Imagination, coming up with something, maybe true or false. Little girl in 4th grade, mom calls me and says, she's telling me there are aliens in her classroom. Do I need to be concerned about psychosis? What's going on? She hasn't been doing that since she was little. Well, if your 3-year-old is telling you about aliens in his classroom, do you worry about it? No. 3-year-olds are super people. 4-year-olds are super people. I mean, we engage in imaginative play. That's great. The problem is when it's no longer consistent with their age level and when they start to have difficulty distinguishing reality from imagination. And one thing my stance on that is because of this condition, you don't have the luxury of just letting them grow out of it. You don't want to discourage the imaginative play early on, but it may be that by kindergarten you have to start having conversations that are making it very clear, is that real or is that imagination? You're going to be much more explicit about that distinction so that they get practice at that kind of reality testing. What makes you think that happened? What did you see? What did you hear? That kind of reality testing. Lying, I would say, is intentionally misleading somebody else. How many of you would say your ACC are lies? A few. For those who say they lie, do they lie well? Giggles. No, typically it's pretty darn obvious if they're trying to deceive you. And that's one of the things that distinguishes this. In general, are not very good liars because they tend to be honest, they try to lie. Another favorite example is that boy, the cops came to his high school. I went to test him into an assessment, and his bangs were here. I mean, like a half inch. And his mom said, oh, by the way, he also cuts his hair. And he looked at her and he said, I have not cut my hair in 6 months. Beg to differ. I mean, you can lie all you want, but that's pretty obvious. So, they're not always that extreme, but sometimes. What I would say confabulation is honest lying. It's not intentionally trying to deceive you, it's because I think it's true. And if they believe it's true, then is it lying? One question is, where does that idea come from? And so here's what our understanding. Confabulation has been studied mainly in Alzheimer's, dementia patients, where you ask them, what'd you have for breakfast? And they will tell you what they had for breakfast. They have no clue what they had for breakfast. But that's an easy thing to answer. Oh, I had yogurt and coffee. Sound totally confident, completely plausible answer. Keeps them socially engaged, gets you off their back, everything's cool. Except for the fact that they may have had eggs, right? So how many times do you ask your kids a bunch of questions at the end of the school day, and at some point they're just gonna be like, I don't know, I'm just gonna start answering things because that'll just keep them happy and get them off my back and let me go to my bedroom. I'm guessing our typical kids do that some. That it's the filling the gaps. It's, I don't know how to engage socially. This is what my other peers are talking about, so I'm going to throw in my story so that I sound like I've had experiences too. Because somehow I don't get that they're telling stories that are true. I'm just using it as a strategy to connect. But if you push on that strategy, sometimes you'll see that they're then almost get confused because, well, I knew about it. Our classic example of this is a young man that at the conference 20 years ago in Minnesota, one of the moms started talking to him. She's from Canada. They were talking about Montreal. He started talking about the baseball stadium, all the details and what hotel he stayed in and what game he went to and on and on and on. And then later that mom went to his mother and said, oh, he told me about his trip to see, to the game and blah, blah, blah. And his mom said, he's never been there. Oh, but he knew how the stadium was laid out. He knew what the hotel was. He knew, Sports are definitely his focused interest. It's how he connects socially. But he's never been there. So they bring the young man over, who's in his late 20s at the time, and confront him about this. And at first he's like, yes, I've been there. Yes, I've been there. And he walked away. It was almost like, I know all those details. How could I know those details if I hadn't been there? So that's a great example of what we call source memory. I have a memory, I have factual information about something, but I don't know where it came from. And so it would make sense that if I know that much detail, I must have seen it. And it's something we all do. How many of you have seen pictures of yourself as a little kid and you start to think you remember that event? And then you can't, I don't know if I actually remember that birthday or if I just seen those pictures so many times that it feels like I remember that birthday. It's a common issue. It tends to be more common in this group. So not remembering when things happened, temporal ordering, difficulty retrieving information, all of those things can contribute to why it happens. Also, the difficulty of containing instincts or that impulsivity. And part of how we know that something is true is because we have facts and our emotional systems in our brain get connected to those facts and we feel like they're familiar. You see a face and you think, I know you. Did this yesterday, I know you. I don't know where, I don't know how, but I have a gut sense that you're familiar. Well, if those connections aren't working well during the process and the encoding of the memory, then maybe nothing feels that more familiar than anything else. So anything that's in there is fair game. And it is infuriating. Yes? Especially when it's really over the edge. So I just threw these in at the end because I think they're my general go-to of, with all of these things, I'm listing a bunch of things that can be disastrous, that can be problematic, but you want to hear them as a list of things that, okay, how do we start to intervene now to avoid the potential of those things as much as possible? One of my dear friends' son was 10 and he was hitting her. And my other good friend said, how did we get there? How did you get to where your 10-year-old is hitting you? And then this wasn't a disabled 10-year-old, this was a very typical 10-year-old, and there were problems in the parenting that were contributing to why she would allow him to do this. So how did we get there? Now, I would say to any of you who have a teenager or a young adult who has hit you, I'm not gonna say, how did we get there? It happens. I've heard too many parents deal with this. I've seen broken arms. I've seen really painful things because of a person with DCC who gets big and strong and doesn't know what to do with their anger. On the other hand, for those of you who know that that might be a thing, let's see if we can avoid getting there, right? And work together, share strategies with each other, think ahead, and work them toward what they need in life. So we're at the end of our time. But we can stay for a few minutes and do some questions if people want to ask questions. You were very attentive and very quiet. Anybody? Do you hate me now? Yeah.
My daughter was young. I'm very careful of who we allow her to mentor her or babysit. We had a few male babysitters too because we knew that person we trusted. But then I wouldn't hire a male psychologist for some reason. I don't know why. So it wasn't. I just wanted her to be with females. But what is the percentage of disabled people that are abused? I mean, the abuse rate is very high, and that's why we kind of came to that decision.
So the question is, parents saying that they protected their daughter from big, potentially dangerous situations. I do want to honor the fact that you consciously chose some male babysitters that you really trusted so that she would have those positive interactions, because you don't want to set up an extreme, and you want her to know what it feels like to be treated well. That's part of when she recognizes something isn't good, is by knowing when it is good. The reality, I don't know the statistics these days, but people with disabilities are much more likely to be abused than people without. And especially if they're nonverbal, if they have a history of confabulation, if they are socially isolated, all of those things really set you up. But I like that I would also emphasize is reinforcing over and over again, this is what it's supposed to be like. This is how somebody should treat you. And that if you set up the first date with a cousin or someone and they go through the system and they know this is how I'm supposed to be treated, maybe that'll set a precedent. Yeah.
My grandchild is 6 years old. So in daycare center, the teachers were saying he's touching kids and things like that. What do you mean he's touching kids? So she videotaped how he was touching kids. So they're just sitting on the floor and he would just put his hand on somebody's arm or leg and the child goes away and he wants to do the same. Or he might hit somebody he cannot touch somebody without other person consent. So he knows that, and he would repeat it, but he would still touch somebody. And kids just don't want it. But he thinks that really bothers me. How, like, what, he could just, and I saw the child goes, and he just child passes by, and he would just hit him like that.
Well,
What would you do?
yeah, so what do you do with a child who is young and will touch people and just kind of benignly? It's a great time to start building in that, no, you cannot touch somebody outside of your immediate family. You have to have some degree of safety so that there's warmth, and without asking and getting consent. You have to. And you drill it home. I kind of find it sad. But I also, as far as a 6-year-old, I would say that, think of him as 3, and that's totally normal, right? So expecting things developmentally to be delayed also can take some of the concern and pressure off of those kind of behaviors.
I would think that maybe he wants connection, that's why he touches somebody, but he thinks it really bothers me more.
It bothers them.
It bothers me that he hits other children.
He thinks it bothers you.
Yeah, it bothers me that he would just push somebody and hit his child, the other child
Yeah.
don't like it.
Well, and I do think it probably is about connection. And a lot of these situations that come up are about connection. I want my college roommate to like me, so I come up with some fanciful story that makes me seem kind of needy and important and becomes my identity at college. It's completely not true. But it's connection. It's a way of connecting. And these are, they're very difficult topics. One other topic I did not talk about in all of this is hygiene. I should put that one in there, because that is a social issue, it's a sexual issue, and one of the things that we've started to see is actually hygiene in our teenagers with ACC gets worse in girls in the teen years than the boys. The boys drop off in earlier adolescence, it looks like, and start to come back up to more typical, and the girls are not doing so hot. So that's another issue to be very explicit about early on, set standards. Because
Doesn't always help though. So I tell my daughter to take a shower every 2 days. Just have to remind her, but it never happens.
yep,
Even though she does it.
even though she does it. Well, and the one thing I would say is, you may feel like I am having to do all of the reminding, and for heaven's sakes, will this ever sink in? It may. It's just a protracted angle of development. So if your target is not to get them to 18 or 20, but it's to get them to 30, pace yourselves, get lots of support, bring in other people, try not to hate them, which I say tongue-in-cheek, but kind of true, because I've had parents come up to me and say just that, like, my main objective right now is to not hate my child. He hits me. Yeah, it's understandable to have times when you feel like this has hijacked my life and I don't know what to do with this, and it's going to go on forever.
I try different angles. I try to almost be insulting sometimes. Well, how did everybody enjoy your body odor today? Because obviously, deodorant, again, that just
But insults and sarcasm typically are not going to work. No. So, thank you all for your attention. Please keep sharing things as you come up with ideas. Share them with me, because it informs what we talk about. And blessings to you all in this journey.
Dr. Paul. We really appreciate it. I was able to get some surveys, so if you guys would like to pick up a survey, it lists all the sessions there. If you wouldn't mind filling one out and dropping it off at the registration. Yeah, you can do that at the end, as you go through all your sessions. That would be great. We really appreciate all the feedback to make these the most beneficial to you guys. Thank you again for Dr. Paul. Let's give her another round of applause.
Thank you.